Hello, fish friends and mermaids. Happy Saturday. I am recording at night, but it's all good. It's still Saturday. So we're picking up on chapter 3 with Nancy Drew's Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion. And if you remember, Nancy has just made it to Florida to help her dad on a case. And now they are at that house in chapter 3, Spooky Grounds. When Nancy rushed from the rear entrance of the Billington home, she headed for the orange grove. A distance beyond, she could see a wavering light and assumed that someone with a flashlight was walking among the trees. I wonder who the person is, she asked herself. Anton? When George and Mr. Drew caught up to Nancy, they said Bess had remained with Hannah. Nancy mentioned the light. They had not noticed it, and now the beam had vanished. When the three had left in such a hurry, they had neglected to bring flashlights. As they progressed deeper into the grove, the searchers could see practically nothing under the trees. We'll never be able to find the orange packing house, George remarked. They went on for several seconds. Then Nancy stopped. I guess you're right. We'll come back in the morning and find out if there's an extension in the packing house. I'm inclined to believe it was Anton calling from there. What do you two think? Mr. Drew agreed, but George said it might have been Tina. Don't forget, Nancy, that you heard a door close softly. Nancy made no reply. She had turned to go back to the house, but suddenly realized she did not know which direction to take. She consulted her companions. Mr. Drew laughed. I should think a detective like you could find her way in the dark, he teased. Just for that, said his daughter, I'll lead you right back to the Billingtons. She began to feel the tree trunks, saying to herself, we came north, and that would be the roughest side of the tree. Presently she found the south side and then said, Follow me. The trees, though planted in straight rows, were not in lines parallel to the compass. Nancy felt the bark of each tree she came to and kept veering slightly eastward. In a little while, the lights of the Billington house came into view. You did it, George praised her. Nancy laughed. I played leader this time, but either of you could have found the way. When the three came into the kitchen, they were greeted by Hannah and Bess. Mission accomplished? Mrs. Groon asked. That's Nancy's housekeeper. I'm afraid not, Nancy replied. Then she whispered, Has Anton come in? Bess replied, Yes. He rushed past the two of us without saying a word and went upstairs. He sure is a weirdo. In low voices, the group discussed the Rizzardos. While they had no proof the couple was dishonest, each of them had a feeling of mistrust. Hannah suggested that as a safety precaution, the visitors lock their bedroom doors. Everyone looked at Mr. Drew. Would he agree to lock his? To their surprise, he did. He said no more, but the others were sure Nancy's father was taking no chances with the caretaker and his wife in the house. The night passed peacefully, however. When the Drews and their friends assembled for breakfast, Anton and Tina had not yet come downstairs. Just as the group finished eating, the couple appeared. They said good morning, but carried on no conversation. They helped themselves to the food Hannah had left on the stove and ate in the kitchen. Presently, Anton went out the rear door. Tina announced she was going shopping and did not offer to help with the housework. She hurried away. Hannah grew and was exasperated. How long does that woman expect me to wash her dirty dishes and prepare her meals? I'll speak to them later, Mr. Drew promised. I'm leaving now in Mr. Billington's car to see Mr. Dotson, the lawyer I engaged to help me on this case. Tina had already left in Rizzardo's car. Was she going grocery shopping or on some errands of her own? I don't know whether to buy any supplies or not, said Hannah. What do you think, girls? Bess, who was hungry most of the time, answered, I vote we buy some food and not depend on that awful creature. But how are we going to get it? George spoke up. We have no car. Mrs. Gruen sighed. I guess we can make out until your father returns and you can borrow the car. As soon as the necessary housework, LOL, was finished, the girls set off through the orange grove to find the packing house. It was a good distance ahead. On the way, Nancy and her friends saw many men picking oranges and putting them into baskets. A small truck would pick them up. The packing house at the far end of the grove was a long rectangular building. It contained machinery for sorting oranges by size, cartons for mailing fruit, and net sacks for local delivery. Men and women were busy picking out defective fruit. There was a glass partition office in one corner. On the desk stood a telephone. Nancy walked up to one of the men and inquired if Anton was around. She learned he had not been there all morning. I can't say when he'll be back, the workman continued. He stays away from here a good deal nowadays, but that's all right. We get along without him. The girls looked questioningly at one another, but made no comment. Nancy asked them, is the telephone here on a separate line, or is it an extension of one at the house? It's an intercom system with 4 extensions on this one number. 2 of them are in the house. A third is at the side of the building. Would you like to make a call? Yes, I would, Nancy replied, glad of the chance to let her eyes roam around the office desk for a clue to the mysterious phone conversation. She was disappointed not to find any, but Hannah Gruen had a message for her. Mrs. Nickerson called. She said something of interest has come up and she wants you to stop over as soon as possible. She didn't say what it was, Nancy queried. No, Hannah replied. Nancy said the girls would visit Mrs. Nickerson when they could use Mr. Billington's car. We'll see you in a little while, Hannah. Excuse me. She and her friends watched the sorting and packing operation. Nancy spoke to several of the workers. Not one of them could give any information about the identity of the man who had delivered the oranges with the explosives in them. All the men declared they knew nothing about it except what had been in the newspapers. One thing they were sure of, Mr. Billington was innocent. They hoped he would soon be exonerated. The girls heard a truck arriving and went outside to watch it being unloaded. Baskets of oranges were lifted onto a belt which carried them to a chute where the fruit was dumped into the washing and sorting machine. Nancy stood near the truck, gazing at the man who was lifting out the baskets. Suddenly one slipped from his hands and came tumbling directly toward Nancy's head. "Look out!" cried Bess behind her. Fortunately, Nancy had seen the basket and leaped out of the way. The fruit smashed to the ground. Her first thought was that the man had dropped it on purpose. And then she rationalized what possible purpose could he have in harming her. He did not apologize. Nancy went inside and asked her workman his name. "It's Jackson," he replied. "We call him Old Clumsy Fingers." Nancy smiled and said that explained why she had almost been hit with the basket of oranges. Nancy, Bess, and George walked back through the grove, disappointed that they had learned nothing to advance their sleuthing. As they approached the house, Nancy told the girls about Mrs. Nickerson's call. "But we can't go there without a car. It's too far. I hope Dad will be back soon." When he had not returned by late morning, Nancy became restless. She was on the verge of telephoning Mrs. Nickerson when George, who had been exploring the grounds, dashed into the house. "Guess what I saw?" she explained. "The Billingtons' boat. It's neat. Why don't we go to the Nickersons in that?" "Great idea," Bess spoke up. "Let's see if it will run." Nancy told him where the girls were going. Then the 3 hurried through the Billingtons' lovely garden to the waterfront. Only a few motorboats were purring along the shores of the Indian River. The end of the garden was several feet above the water level and had a bulkhead to keep soil from washing away. A boathouse extended into the river. Inside it was a sleek speedboat, the Starbeam. The key was in the ignition. "What a beauty!" Bess cried out, "but it looks powerful. Nancy, would you dare take it out?" The young detective smiled. "Of course." She made sure there was sufficient fuel and familiarized herself with the various gadgets. Her eyes twinkling, she said, "Here goes." In a few seconds, the motor was throbbing quietly, and she steered the craft into the river. 20 minutes later, she pulled alongside a dock, which bore the name Nickerson. The girls tied the boat securely and went up to the house. Ned's mother was a very attractive woman. When greeting Nancy, she showed the deep affection she held for the girl. "What I wanted to tell you," Mrs. Nickerson said as they all sipped glasses of cola, "is that friends of ours who have gone north to live have put their house on the market. It's listed with Mr. Gilbert Scarlett, a local realtor. I was thinking how wonderful it would be, Nancy, if your father would buy the place." "I'd love to see it," Nancy replied. "Is it far from here?" "No. We can walk there easily." Mrs. Nickerson led the girls to a charming place about a quarter of a mile away. The house stood halfway between the river and the road. It was a 2-story building with attractive, well-kept grounds. "How lovely!" Nancy exclaimed. "The owner, Mr. Webster," said Mrs. Nickerson, "has all kinds of unusual trees and shrubs on the place, besides an orange grove. He even has a sausage tree. It is rarely seen in this country." A sausage tree sounds very, very interesting. The visitors were intrigued by the wide variety of trees and shrubs. Each had a plaque attached that gave its Latin botanical name and the English equivalent. Finally, they came to the sausage tree. It was about 30 feet tall with a profusion of leaves. From the branches hung greenish sausage-shaped fruit that resembled rough, textured melons. They were nearly 6 inches wide and 12 inches long. George felt one. "Wow, this would make a real swinging weapon." The others laughed. Mrs. Nickerson said the fruit was not edible, and the pollen was carried in the spring from one flower to another by bats. "Ugh!" Bess exclaimed. The tree was near a high wire mesh fence, which looked strong enough to stop a large, fast-moving truck. Bess remarked, "That place next door sure is spooky with all those old trees dripping with Spanish moss. Who lives there?" "I don't know," Mrs. Nickerson replied. At that moment, a chilling scream came from inside the grounds. All right. Let's read chapter 4. Newspaper quill. The piercing scream was not repeated. Nancy and her friends peered through the wire mesh fence for a glimpse of a house. The jungle of trees with their long streamers of Spanish moss concealed whatever buildings might be on the property. Nancy turned to Mrs. Nickerson. "Have you ever been in there?" "No," Ned's mother replied. "The place is so forbidding. I've never tried to get acquainted with occupants." I have a tickle in my throat. Besides, I suspect whoever lives there owns some wild animals. George said she was curious to find out what she could. If this fence doesn't go around the whole property, let's look for an opening and go in. Bess objected at once. "Not me." Nancy settled the matter. "Actually, we don't have time," she said. "Dad will be home, I'm sure, and I want to see if he has any news for us, but we'll come here the first chance we have." Mrs. Nickerson teased, "Now I understand how you girls become involved in mysteries." Nancy smiled. "Sometimes we do stumble upon them." The group walked back to the Nickerson home, said goodbye, and hurried to their boat. When they reached the Billington house, Mr. Drew was there. He was smiling, and Nancy was sure he had had a successful morning. I like Mr. Dotson very much. It didn't take long to talk over the case, the lawyer said. Mr. Drew delved into the breast pocket of his sports jacket and pulled out an envelope. Surprise for you girls, he announced. He handed the envelope to Nancy. She opened it and took out 6 badges on which the word press was printed. Mr. Drew explained, as an accredited writer, I was given badges at the News Center for you and the boys to watch the moon shoot next week. Bess and George stared at Mr. Drew. You are an accredited writer? Writer? Bess asked. He chuckled and nodded. I have a number of publications to my credit. Of course, they're all on legal matters. How exciting, said George. Now we can see the liftoff and be as close as anyone is allowed. Right. Mr. Drew asked Hannah and the girls if they would like to make a tour of the Kennedy Space Center that afternoon. All were enthusiastic, and Nancy said, it will give me a chance to get acquainted with the place where the explosive oranges were taken. I might pick up a clue. As soon as luncheon was over, they set off for the vast, well-kept government grounds that stretched along the ocean for miles. Mr. Drew parked the car near a sprawling building with a large roofed-over patio area. Under it were benches. Nancy and the others sat down to wait for a bus while her father bought tickets. This is the Visitor Information Center, Mr. Drew remarked when he came back. Nancy was impressed by the large number of European and Asiatic tourists who were there. The Kennedy Space Center means a lot to the whole world, she thought, then walked up to the adjoining building to peer inside. There was a room with illuminated wall pictures of the various types of missiles. Here visitors could purchase books, postcards, and souvenirs. Nancy saw an intriguing miniature model rock. I must come back and buy that, she decided. All aboard, called George, and Nancy hurried to join the others. The 2-hour tour began, and the driver announced that they would cover 50 miles. Nancy and her friends were fascinated by the mock-ups of missiles and rockets stretching ahead of them in long rows. Most of them were in the familiar cone shape. The guide said that the very first missile sent up from the Cape was a 2-stage bumper. The first stage was a captured German V-2 missile, and the second an Army WAC Corporal rocket. It was launched in July 1950. Mr. Drew whispered to his daughter, our country has certainly come a long way in rocket building since then. As the guide indicated gantries and rockets, Nancy recognized the names Thor, an early anti-ballistic missile, Titan, Minuteman, and Saturn. Next, the guide talked about the artificial satellites orbiting in space. He explained that the man-made moons are classified according to the jobs they do. Communication satellites, weather satellites, navigation satellites, scientific satellites, and military satellites. You no doubt are familiar with the Teros and other satellites that take weather pictures and track hurricanes. Communication satellites like Earlybird and Telstar make it possible to send radio messages, telephone calls, and television programs from one continent to another in a matter of seconds. The tour continued on to the moon rocket, which stood majestically next to its gantry. The onlookers craned their necks to see the top where the astronauts would live and work. It's all so overwhelming, Hannah Gruen exclaimed. The next stop on the tour was at the Mammoth Vehicle Assembly Building, George remarked. This is a real skyscraper. And it covers 8 acres, the driver said. The ceilings and the wings of this building are 20 stories high. That's where the smaller rockets are put together. That center section is 52 stories high. The big Saturns for trips to the moon and other planets are assembled in this area. Each booster for them is brought here on a very long covered barge which resembles an aluminum Quonset hut painted white. The capsules come by truck or air. When the sightseers walked inside to the vehicle assembly section, they gasped. The center section was tall enough to accommodate a 360-foot rocket standing upright. Around the walls of the huge structure were metal scaffolds on which men had worked to complete the latest rocket assembly. From the ground floor, those who were busy high above the visitors looked no larger than small boys. This is absolutely fascinating and unbelievable, Nancy said. Suddenly she realized that Hannah Gruen was not with them. She looked at all the visitors but did not see the Drews' housekeeper. Maybe she stayed in the bus, Nancy thought, and went outside to look. Hannah was not there. Where could she have gone, Nancy asked herself, then told her fathers and the girls. All of them searched but could not find Hannah. The guide was already calling to his passengers to board the bus. I don't want to leave without Hannah, Nancy said to her father. This building is so huge that if she started to walk around it, she couldn't possibly be back by this time. Mr. Drew said he had an appointment with Commander Nickel at the base in connection with the case. Suppose I go ahead, he suggested, and you girls keep on searching for Hannah. You can catch the next bus. He spoke to the driver, who agreed that this would be all right. Nancy, Bess, and George went back inside the big building and began looking again for Hannah. Moments later, the door to an office opened. Hannah Gruen walked out, followed by a young man. They came directly to the three girls. This is Herb Baylor, Hannah said. He's a distant relative of mine, but I didn't know he was here. I happened to see him walk into an office and followed. After the pleasant young man had acknowledged the introductions, Hannah went on. Herb's an engineer and works on the assembling of rockets. Nancy asked him, Of course you know about the oranges containing the explosives that were sent into the base. Yes, and I hear you're on Merritt Island to solve the mystery and clear Mr. Billington. He smiled boyishly. I'll tell you a possible clue that I gave to security. Wonderful, Nancy replied. What is it? Herb said he happened to be near the truck when it was leaving. Part of a newspaper blew out. I picked it up and noticed the pencil ring personnel. It was a garble of words that made no sense. What did it say? Herb replied, Son on board ship, ready to be sailor for peaceful kind of action. Nancy took a pad and pencil from her handbag. Asked Herb to repeat the message. Quickly, she read words numbered 1, 5, 9, and 13. The hidden message was, Son ready for action. She thanked Herb, telling him that the girls would work on it. I wish you luck, he said smilingly. Now I must go back. When the next bus came, Nancy and her friends climbed aboard. The tour continued, and Nancy listened attentively to the driver's descriptions. On a long flight, like to the moon, the guide said, an astronaut gets about 2,800 calories of food a day. 17% of this is protein, 32% fat, and 51% carbohydrates. Bess gave a low giggle. That's the place for me. The guide went on to say that the men eat 4 meals a day, and a series of menus are rotated every 4 days. All the food is in bars, cubes, and powders sealed in plastic pouches or paste, which are kept in tubes. Bess called out to the guide, Could you tell us what some of the menus are? The man smiled. Yes. How would you like this for breakfast? strawberry cereal cubes, bacon squares, peanut butter sandwiches, and orange juice. That's great, said Bess. Here's a typical dinner menu, the guide told her. Beef with vegetables, spaghetti with meat sauce, toast squares, fruit cake made with dates and tea. That would suit me, Bess commented. It sounds yummy. When the bus returned to the visitor information center, Mr. Drew was waiting for them and they walked to the parking area. As soon as they were seated in their car, George said, Nancy, don't keep us in suspense any longer. What did you figure out of that newspaper clue? Nancy told her, and the conversation turned to a series of guesses as to what it meant. They could only surmise that someone, somewhere, was ready to strike a blow. But who, and at what? When the group reached the house, the Rosars were not there. Hannah remarked, I suppose they won't show up until dinner's ready. The girls offered to help her prepare dinner. When Nancy went into the dining room to set the table, she noticed that a photograph of her father, which she had sent Mr. Billington, was gone from the buffet. She asked the others if any of them had placed it elsewhere. No one had. How strange, said Hannah. She hurried into the living room and called out, a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Billington is gone too. On a hunch, Nancy rushed upstairs to her father's room. A photograph of her with Bess and George, which he always took with him when he traveled, had been removed from the bureau. Next, the young detective went to her own room and pulled out a dresser drawer. She had left a wallet in it containing a snapshot of her father and one of Ned Nickerson. They were missing, but none of the other contents had been taken. Nancy dashed down the stairs. Every photograph has been taken, she exclaimed. I'm sure they were stolen to use as identification of us because we're trying to solve the mystery of the explosive oranges. Alright, thank you so much for joining me on Story Saturday. That was chapter 3 and 4, and I hope you guys have a marvelous and safe day. Bye!